The sound of sirens cut through the summer air like a knife through butter, growing louder as three police cruisers wound their way down the narrow lakefront road. Red and blue lights flashed against the towering pine trees, casting an eerie glow over what had been, just moments before, the perfect Saturday afternoon party. Jet skis bobbed peacefully in the crystal-clear water, their engines silent now as 20-some guests turned to watch the approaching vehicles with a mixture of curiosity and concern. I stood on my deck, barbecue tongs still in hand, watching as the officers stepped out of their cars and began walking toward my property. Behind them, I could see Karen Peterson, the Homeowners Association president, practically vibrating with satisfaction as she pointed in my direction. Her perfectly manicured finger jabbed through the air like she was conducting some sort of vengeful orchestra, and I could see her lips moving rapidly as she spoke to the lead officer. The other HOA board members clustered around her in the parking lot, their arms crossed and faces set in identical expressions of righteous indignation. They had clearly been waiting for this moment, probably watching from their windows all afternoon, just hoping for an opportunity to call the authorities on what they considered my increasingly disruptive weekend gatherings. As the officers approached, I calmly set down my tongs and walked to the edge of my deck. The lead officer, a tall man with graying temples and the weathered look of someone who had seen it all, raised his hand in a gesture that was meant to be both greeting and warning. His partners flanked him, their hands resting casually on their duty belts, ready for whatever drama they expected to unfold. Karen's voice carried clearly across the distance between us, her tone sharp with authority and barely contained triumph. She was explaining to the officers how I had been violating noise ordinances, disrupting the peaceful lakefront community, and trespassing on Homeowners Association managed property. Her words tumbled over each other in her eagerness to make her case, painting me as some sort of neighborhood menace who needed to be stopped before things got completely out of hand. I reached into my back pocket and pulled out a folded document that I had been carrying with me ever since the first time Karen had tried to tell me what I could and could not do on my own property. The paper was slightly worn from being handled, but the official seals and signatures were still clearly visible. As the officers reached the base of my deck, I held up the document with a calm smile. "Actually," I said, my voice carrying the quiet confidence of someone who knew exactly where they stood, "they are the ones who are trespassing on my property." I gestured toward Karen and her fellow board members, who were still standing in what they believed to be the community parking lot. "That deed in my hand proves that I own not just this house and the land it sits on, but the entire lake you see behind me, and that parking lot where they are currently standing." The lead officer's eyebrows rose slightly, and I could see Karen's confident expression begin to falter as the implications of my words started to sink in. The other officers exchanged glances, clearly recognizing that this was not going to be the straightforward noise complaint they had been expecting to handle. The afternoon sun glinted off the water behind me, and for a moment the only sound was the gentle lapping of waves against the shore and the distant call of a loon somewhere across the lake. "My name is Jake Morrison, and 6 months ago, I thought I was just buying a nice little lake house for weekend getaways. I had been working in tech consulting for nearly 15 years, building up a successful business that allowed me to work remotely from anywhere with a decent internet connection. The city had started to feel suffocating after years of deadlines and client meetings, and I found myself dreaming of somewhere peaceful where I could unwind and maybe do a little fishing on the weekends. When my real estate agent first showed me the property, I fell in love with it immediately. The house itself was modest but well-maintained, with a wraparound deck that offered stunning views of the lake. The previous owner had been an elderly gentleman who had lived there for over 40 years, and he had taken excellent care of both the house and the surrounding grounds. What really sold me, though, was the privacy. The house sat on a small peninsula that jutted out into the lake, surrounded by mature trees that provided natural screening from the other lakefront properties. The price seemed almost too good to be true, especially considering the prime location and the fact that similar properties in the area were going for significantly more money. When I asked my agent about it, she explained that the previous owner had been motivated to sell quickly due to health issues, and he had priced the property to move fast rather than maximize profit. She assured me that all the paperwork was in order, and that the title search had come back clean. What I did not realize at the time was exactly how much property I was actually buying. The deed included not just the house and the immediate grounds, but also something called riparian rights to the entire lake. In simple terms, this meant that I owned the lake itself, along with the right to control access to it. Additionally, the property boundaries extended much further than I had initially understood, including a strip of land that the surrounding neighborhood had been using as a community parking area for decades. The Homeowners Association had been formed in the 1970s when the lakefront community was first developed. At that time, the previous owner of my property had apparently given verbal permission for residents to use his extra land as parking, and over the years, this arrangement had become so routine that everyone simply assumed it was part of the HOA common areas. The association had even gone so far as to include maintenance of the parking area in their annual budget, treating it as community property that they had every right to manage. For the first few months after I moved in, everything was peaceful. I spent my weekends reading on the deck, taking long walks around the lake, and slowly getting to know my new neighbors. The Homeowners Association seemed friendly enough, though I noticed they had a lot of rules about everything from lawn maintenance to the color of exterior paint that homeowners were allowed to use. Since I was mostly just trying to keep a low profile and enjoy my new retreat, I did not pay much attention to their various regulations and requirements. That all changed when I decided to buy a jet ski. I had always enjoyed water sports, and the lake seemed perfect for some weekend recreation. The first time I took it out, I felt like a kid again, racing across the crystal clear water with the wind in my hair and the sun on my face. The lake was large enough that I could really open up the throttle without worrying about disturbing anyone, and the scenery was absolutely breathtaking from the middle of the water. After a few solo rides, I started inviting friends from the city to come up and join me for weekend barbecues. We would spend the day on the water, trying out different jet skis and wakeboards, then fire up the grill in the evening and enjoy dinner on the deck. The gatherings were never huge, usually just 8 to 10 people, and we always tried to be respectful of the quiet hours that the neighborhood seemed to observe. That was when I first encountered Karen Peterson. She appeared at my door one Sunday morning, dressed in what I would later learn was her standard uniform of pressed khakis and a polo shirt with the HOA logo embroidered on the chest. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a tight ponytail, and she carried herself with the air of someone who was accustomed to being in charge. She introduced herself as the president of the Homeowners Association and explained that she had received several complaints about noise and activity coming from my property. Karen's tone was polite but firm as she explained the various community standards that she felt I was violating. According to her, the lakefront was supposed to maintain a certain level of decorum, and my weekend parties were disrupting the peaceful atmosphere that residents had come to expect. She handed me a copy of the HOA bylaws, pointing out specific sections about noise levels, guest parking, and the proper use of waterfront areas. I listened politely, but I have to admit that her authoritative tone rubbed me the wrong way. I had bought my property specifically to get away from exactly this kind of micromanagement, and I had no intention of letting a neighborhood busybody dictate how I spent my weekends. When she finished her presentation, I thanked her for the information but made it clear that I did not consider myself bound by HOA rules since I had never signed any agreement to join their association. Karen's eyes narrowed slightly at my response, and I could see that she was not accustomed to having her authority questioned. She explained that all lakefront properties were automatically included in the association, and that the previous owner had been a member in good standing for decades. When I suggested that she show me any documents proving that I was required to follow HOA rules, she promised to get back to me with the relevant paperwork. That was the beginning of what would become an increasingly tense relationship between Karen and me. Over the next few weeks, she made several more visits to my property, each time armed with different documents and regulations that she claimed gave the HOA authority over my weekend activities. I reviewed everything she brought me, but I could not find any binding agreement that would require me to follow their rules or pay their fees. Meanwhile, my weekend gatherings continued to grow. Word had spread among my friends about the beautiful lake house and the fun we were having, and more people started asking if they could join us for barbecues and water sports. I was happy to have them, and I made sure to stock up on extra jet skis and water equipment so everyone could participate. The parties were becoming the highlight of my week, a perfect way to decompress from the stress of running my business. Karen's visits became more frequent and her tone more demanding. She started showing up with other HOA board members, as if having additional witnesses would somehow make her arguments more compelling. They complained about everything from the music volume to the number of cars parked in what they insisted was the community parking area. When I pointed out that the parking was on my property, they dismissed my claim and insisted that the area had been community property for decades. The situation reached a boiling point on a particularly beautiful Saturday in late June. I had invited about 20 friends up for what I was calling my annual summer kickoff party. We had 4 jet skis in the water, a full barbecue spread on the deck, and a playlist of classic rock that was admittedly a bit louder than usual. The weather was perfect, everyone was having a great time, and I was feeling more relaxed than I had in months. That was when Karen appeared, marching across the parking area with her phone pressed to her ear. I could see her gesturing angrily in my direction as she spoke, and it was clear that she was not just making a social call. She ended her phone conversation and stormed up to the edge of my deck, her face flushed with anger and determination. "This ends now," she announced, her voice cutting through the music and conversation. "I have had enough of your complete disregard for this community and its standards. You cannot just move in here and turn our peaceful lakefront into some kind of party zone. I am calling the police, and they are going to shut this down once and for all." I set down my drink and walked over to where she was standing, keeping my voice calm and level despite the adrenaline that was starting to course through my veins. "Karen, this is my property, and these are my guests. We are not violating any laws, and we are not causing any actual harm to anyone. Maybe you should just go back to your house and let us enjoy our weekend." Her laugh was sharp and humorless, and I could see the other HOA board members gathering behind her like some kind of suburban cavalry. "Your property ends at your property line, Jake. That lake belongs to the community, and you are trespassing on HOA-managed waters. And this parking lot where your friends have left their cars? Also community property. You are about to learn that there are consequences for thumbing your nose at properly established authority." With that, she pulled out her phone and dialed 911. I watched in disbelief as she calmly explained to the dispatcher that there was a large, disruptive party taking place on community property, and that the organizer was refusing to comply with lawful requests to shut it down. She made it sound like I was some kind of dangerous criminal who was holding the neighborhood hostage with my reckless behavior. As we waited for the police to arrive, Karen and her board members positioned themselves in the parking area like they were preparing for some kind of siege. They whispered among themselves, occasionally pointing in my direction and nodding with the satisfied expressions of people who were certain that justice was finally about to be served. My guests had noticed the commotion and gradually gathered on the deck behind me, unsure of what was happening, but clearly sensing that the party atmosphere had taken a serious turn. I excused myself and went into the house, heading straight for the filing cabinet where I kept all of my important documents. When I had first bought the property, my lawyer had insisted on doing an extremely thorough title search, partly because the price had seemed too good to be true. The results of that search had revealed some interesting details about exactly what I was purchasing. Details that I had not paid much attention to at the time, but that were about to become very relevant. The deed was a thick document, full of legal language and technical descriptions, but the key points were clear enough. In addition to the house and the immediate grounds, I owned something called all riparian rights and water access privileges associated with the entirety of Pine Lake. The document went on to specify that these rights included exclusive control over all recreational Pine Lake and commercial activities taking place on or above the water surface. More importantly, the property boundaries were much more extensive than I had realized. The survey that had been conducted as part of the purchase process showed that my land extended well beyond what I had assumed, including a significant strip along the shoreline that encompassed the area currently being used as community parking. The previous owner had apparently allowed the neighborhood to use this land for decades, but legally, it had never stopped being private property. I folded the deed carefully and put it in my back pocket, then returned to the deck to wait for the police to arrive. Karen was still holding court in the parking area, her voice carrying clearly across the distance as she explained to anyone who would listen exactly how she was going to put an end to my disruptive behavior once and for all. The confidence in her voice was unmistakable, and it was clear that she genuinely believed she held all the cards in this particular confrontation. When the police cruisers finally appeared, winding their way down the lakefront road with their lights flashing, Karen practically vibrated with excitement. She positioned herself at the front of the group of HOA board members, clearly intending to be the primary spokesperson for their complaint. As the officers got out of their cars and began walking toward my property, she started talking immediately, her words tumbling over each other in her eagerness to make her case. "Officers, thank you so much for coming," she began, her voice taking on the tone of someone who was accustomed to being taken seriously by authority figures. "This situation has been escalating for weeks, and we desperately need your help to restore order to our community. This man has been hosting increasingly disruptive parties, violating our noise ordinances, and completely ignoring our legitimate request for him to show some consideration for his neighbors." The lead officer nodded politely as she spoke, but I could see that he was also taking in the scene around him. His eyes moved from the modest gathering on my deck to the group of clearly agitated HOA members in the parking area, and I got the impression that he was trying to assess exactly what kind of situation he was walking into. His partners spread out slightly, their body language professional but relaxed, suggesting that they did not perceive any immediate threat. Karen continued her explanation, her voice growing more animated as she detailed what she saw as my various infractions. "He claims this is all his private property, but that is simply not true. The lake is managed by our Homeowners Association and has been for decades, and this parking area where he has been allowing his guests to leave their cars, also community property. He is essentially trespassing on association-managed land and then claiming that we are the ones in the wrong." The officer's expression remained neutral, but I noticed that he glanced in my direction as Karen made her claims about property ownership. When she finally paused for breath, he raised his hand slightly to indicate that he wanted to speak. "Ma'am, I appreciate you taking the time to explain the situation. Now, I need to speak with the property owner to get his side of the story. After that, we can figure out what, if anything, needs to be done here." Karen's face flushed slightly at the suggestion that there might be another side to the story, but she stepped back with obvious reluctance as the officers approached my deck. I walked down to meet them at ground level, the folded deed still secure in my back pocket, and extended my hand to the lead officer in greeting. "Good afternoon, officers. I am Jake Morrison, and this is my property. I understand there has been some kind of complaint about noise or disturbance, and I am happy to address any legitimate concerns you might have." My voice was calm and respectful, the tone of someone who had nothing to hide and was confident in their position. The lead officer shook my hand and introduced himself as Sergeant Williams. His partners were Officers Chen and Rodriguez, and all three of them had the professional demeanor of experienced law enforcement officers who had dealt with neighborhood disputes before. Sergeant Williams pulled out a small notebook and pen, clearly intending to document whatever resolution they reached. "Mr. Morrison, we received a complaint about a loud party and possible trespassing. The complainant says you are using community property without permission and disturbing the peace. Can you tell me your side of what is happening here?" His tone was neutral and fact-finding, without any hint of prejudgment about who was right or wrong in the situation. I nodded and gestured toward my guests, who were still gathered on the deck watching the proceedings with obvious curiosity. "I am hosting a small barbecue for some friends, as I do most weekends during the summer. We have been playing some music and using jet skis on the lake, but nothing that would violate any noise, ordinances, or laws. As for the trespassing allegation, I think there may be some confusion about exactly who owns what around here." Sergeant Williams glanced back toward Karen and the HOA board members, who were still clustered in the parking area watching every word of our conversation. "The complainant says you are using association property without permission. She claims the lake and the parking area are managed by the Homeowners Association, not private property. What is your response to that?" This was the moment I had been waiting for. I reached into my back pocket and carefully unfolded the deed, making sure not to damage the official seals and signatures that would prove its authenticity. "Actually, Sergeant, I think you will find that the situation is exactly the opposite of what Mrs. Peterson has described. I own not just this house and the land it sits on, but the entire lake and the area where she and her board members are currently standing." I handed him the document and watched as his eyebrows rose slightly while he scanned the legal description and property boundaries. Officer Chen moved closer to read over his shoulder, and I could see both of them taking note of the official seals and signatures that marked the deed as a legitimate legal document. The silence stretched out for several long moments as they absorbed the implications of what they were reading. "This appears to show that you own the lake and a significant amount of additional property," Sergeant Williams said slowly, his voice taking on the careful tone of someone who realized that the situation was more complicated than it had initially appeared. "Are you saying that the parking area where the complainants are standing is actually part of your private property?" I nodded and pointed to the relevant section of the survey that was attached to the deed. "According to the legal survey that was conducted when I purchased the property, my boundaries extend well beyond what most people realize. The previous owner apparently allowed the neighborhood to use that land for parking, but it was never officially transferred to the Homeowners Association. Legally, it has always remained private property." Officer Rodriguez had been listening to our conversation while keeping an eye on Karen and the other HOA members, and I could see him trying to suppress a slight smile as the irony of the situation became clear. The people who had called the police to report trespassing were themselves trespassing on private property, while the person they had accused of wrongdoing was actually the legitimate property owner. Sergeant Williams folded the deed carefully and handed it back to me, then turned to address Karen and her group. "Mrs. Peterson, could you please come over here? I need to discuss some new information that has come to light regarding this complaint." His tone was professional but firm, suggesting that the dynamic of the situation was about to shift significantly. Karen approached with obvious confidence, clearly expecting to hear that the officers were about to arrest me or at least order me to shut down my party. The other board members followed closely behind her, their expressions ranging from smug satisfaction to barely contained excitement. It was clear that they had been waiting for this moment for weeks, and they were expecting complete vindication of their position. "Officers, I hope you have explained to Mr. Morrison that his behavior is completely unacceptable and that these parties need to stop immediately," Karen began before Sergeant Williams had a chance to speak. "This community has standards, and we cannot allow one person to disrupt the peaceful enjoyment that all of our residents have a right to expect." Sergeant Williams held up his hand to interrupt her, and I could see a slight change in his expression that suggested he was not pleased with her presumptuous tone. "Ma'am, I need to inform you that Mr. Morrison has provided documentation showing that he is the legal owner of the property where you and your associates are currently standing. According to his deed, the parking area you are using is actually part of his private property, not community land managed by your association." The change in Karen's expression was immediate and dramatic. The confident smile disappeared from her face, replaced by a look of confusion and growing alarm. She glanced back at the other board members, who were equally stunned by this unexpected development. For several long moments, no one spoke, and I could practically see the gears turning in Karen's head as she tried to process this new information. "That cannot be right," she finally managed, her voice lacking its usual authority and conviction. "This parking area has been community property for decades. The previous owner agreed to let us use it, and we have been maintaining it with association funds. There must be some kind of mistake in those documents." Officer Chen stepped forward and addressed the group of HOA members directly. "Regardless of any informal arrangements that may have existed in the past, the current legal owner of the property has the right to control access to his land. If Mr. Morrison chooses to revoke permission for you to use this area, you would need to comply with his wishes or risk being cited for trespassing." The implications of this statement hit Karen like a physical blow. I could see her mind racing as she realized that not only had her complaint against me failed, but that she and her entire board were now potentially in legal trouble themselves. The parking area they had been treating as community property for years was actually private land that they had been using without the current owner's permission. "But where are we supposed to park?" one of the other board members asked, his voice rising with panic. "This is the only access point to the lake for the entire neighborhood. If we cannot use this area, residents will have to walk half a mile just to reach the beach." I had been listening to this exchange with growing satisfaction, but I decided it was time to make my position clear. Ladies and gentlemen, I have no desire to create unnecessary hardship for anyone in the neighborhood. However, I also have no intention of allowing Mrs. Peterson and the HOA to continue harassing me about my legitimate use of my own property. If you want to continue using my land for parking, we are going to need to establish some ground rules." Karen's face had gone pale, and I could see that she was finally beginning to understand the full scope of her miscalculation. Not only had she failed to shut down my parties, but she had potentially jeopardized the entire neighborhood's access to the lake. The other board members were looking at her with expressions that ranged from confusion to barely concealed anger. Sergeant Williams closed his notebook and addressed both Karen and me directly. "It appears that this is primarily a civil matter involving property rights and neighbor disputes. Mr. Morrison, you have the legal right to control access to your property, but I would encourage you to work with your neighbors to find a reasonable solution. Mrs. Peterson, I would suggest that you contact your association's attorney to review the legal status of the parking arrangement before taking any further action." With that, the three officers began walking back toward their cruisers, leaving Karen and her board members standing in what they now knew was my parking lot. The irony of the situation was not lost on anyone present, and I could see several of my guests struggling to suppress grins as they watched the HOA members grapple with their new reality. Karen turned to face me, her usual commanding presence replaced by something that looked almost like desperation. "Jake, surely we can work something out here. This has all been a terrible misunderstanding. Perhaps we got off on the wrong foot, but I am sure we can find a way to resolve this situation that works for everyone involved." I looked at her for a long moment, considering my options. The vindictive part of me wanted to immediately revoke all parking privileges and force the entire neighborhood to deal with the consequences of Karen's authoritarian behavior. However, the more practical part of me recognized that completely cutting off lake access would hurt innocent residents who had nothing to do with the HOA's harassment campaign. "Karen, I appreciate that you are now interested in finding a reasonable solution to this situation. However, your approach up to this point has been anything but reasonable. You have threatened me with fines, called the police on my legitimate activities, and generally made my life miserable for the past several months. If you want to continue using my property, there are going to be some conditions." I paused to let that sink in, watching as the other board members exchanged worried glances. It was clear that they were beginning to realize just how much power they had inadvertently handed me by calling the police and forcing the property ownership issue to be resolved definitively. First, the Homeowners Association needs to issue a formal written apology for your harassment and acknowledge that I have the right to use my property as I see fit within the bounds of applicable laws. Second, you need to agree in writing that the HOA has no authority over my property or activities, and that you will stop threatening me with fines or other penalties. Third, I want all of the complaints and violations that you have filed against me to be formally withdrawn and expunged from any HOA records. Karen's face cycled through several different expressions as I laid out my terms. I could see her struggling with the idea of admitting that she had been wrong, especially in such a public and definitive way. Her entire authority within the neighborhood was built on the perception that she knew the rules and had the power to enforce them. Acknowledging that she had been completely mistaken would be a significant blow to her credibility. "And if we agree to these conditions?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Then you can continue to use my parking area, and I will continue to be a good neighbor who respects reasonable requests for consideration. But let me be very clear about this. My weekend parties will continue, and I will not be asking for permission from the HOA to use my own property. If you can live with that, then we can probably coexist peacefully." The silence stretched out for what felt like an eternity as Karen weighed her options. I could see her looking back at the other board members, trying to gauge their willingness to support whatever decision she made. Finally, she took a deep breath and nodded slowly. "I will need to discuss this with the full board, but I think we can agree to your conditions. This has obviously been a very difficult situation for everyone involved, and I am sure we all just want to move forward in a positive direction." I nodded and extended my hand to her in what I hoped would be seen as a gesture of good faith. "I think that would be best for everyone, Karen. I have no interest in being the neighborhood villain, but I also will not tolerate being bullied or harassed on my own property. If the HOA can respect those boundaries, I am confident we can find a way to make this work." She shook my hand with obvious reluctance, but I could see that she understood the reality of her situation. The balance of power in our relationship had shifted dramatically, and there was no going back to the way things had been before. The HOA's authority was based on the consent of the governed, and I had just made it clear that my consent was contingent on being treated with respect. Over the next week, I received a formal letter from the Homeowners Association attorney, acknowledging my property rights and withdrawing all complaints and violations that had been filed against me. The letter was carefully worded to avoid admitting any wrongdoing on the part of the HOA, but it accomplished everything I had asked for in practical terms. More importantly, it served as official notice to Karen and the board that any future harassment would have legal consequences. I also took the precaution of having a survey company install permanent markers along my property boundaries, making it crystal clear where my land ended and where any potential community property might begin. The markers served a dual purpose. They protected me from any future disputes about property lines, and they served as a visible reminder to Karen and the HOA about the reality of who owned what in the neighborhood. The following weekend, I hosted what I decided to call my Independence Day party, even though it was still several weeks before the actual 4th of July. The guest list was larger than usual, partly because word had spread about my confrontation with the HOA, and several people wanted to show their support for my right to use my property as I saw fit. We had 6 jet skis in the water, a live band on the deck, and enough barbecue to feed a small army. Karen was notably absent from her usual position as neighborhood watchdog, though I noticed that several other residents made a point of walking past my property to see what all the celebration was about. A few of them even stopped to chat and compliment me on standing up to what they described as the HOA's increasingly authoritarian behavior. Apparently, my situation with Karen was not unique, and several other homeowners had their own stories about unreasonable demands and petty harassment. As the party wound down that evening, I stood on my deck looking out over the lake and reflecting on how much my life had changed since I first bought the property. What had started as a simple desire for a peaceful weekend retreat had evolved into something much more significant, a stand for property rights and individual freedom against the kind of busybody authoritarianism that seemed to be spreading through suburban communities everywhere. The next morning, I woke up to find a small sign posted at the entrance to the parking area. It was professionally made, with neat lettering and official-looking formatting that clearly identified the area as private property. But instead of the usual threatening language that might be expected on such a sign, I had chosen something that I thought captured the spirit of what I was trying to accomplish. Private property, party approved. The sign read in bold, friendly letters. Lake access available to respectful neighbors. Questions? Contact the owner. Below that, I had included my phone number and email address, making it clear that I was open to reasonable communication while maintaining my right to control access to my land. The sign had exactly the effect I had hoped for. Over the next few days, I received several calls and emails from neighbors who wanted to introduce themselves and express their appreciation for the way I had handled the situation with Karen and the HOA. Many of them had their own stories about conflicts with the association, and they were grateful to see that it was possible to push back against unreasonable demands. More importantly, the calls gave me an opportunity to explain my position directly to the people who would be most affected by any restrictions on parking or lake access. I made it clear that I had no intention of cutting off the neighborhood's access to the lake, but that I expected to be treated with the same respect that I was showing to others. The conversations were universally positive, and I started to feel like I was actually becoming part of the community rather than just an outsider who happened to own property there. Karen's response to the sign was predictably negative. I received a terse email from her questioning whether I had obtained proper permits for the signage and demanding that I remove what she called inflammatory and divisive messaging. I responded politely but firmly, explaining that property owners have the right to post appropriate signage on their own land, and that I considered my sign to be both factual and neighborly. That email exchange proved to be our last direct communication. Over the following weeks, I noticed that Karen seemed to be avoiding any situations where she might encounter me directly. Her usual morning walks along the lakefront stopped, and she no longer appeared at community events or gatherings. Other residents mentioned that she had become much less vocal at HOA meetings, and that several of her more controversial proposals had been quietly withdrawn. The summer progressed peacefully, with my weekend parties becoming a regular and increasingly popular feature of lakefront life. What had started as small gatherings of my city friends evolved into larger community events that brought together residents from throughout the neighborhood. People started asking if they could bring dishes to share, and before long the parties had taken on the character of old-fashioned block parties rather than private gatherings. The jet ski parties became legendary throughout the area, drawing visitors from other lake communities who had heard about the fun we were having. I ended up purchasing additional watercraft and safety equipment to accommodate the demand, and I started offering informal lessons to anyone who wanted to learn how to ride. The lake, which had been quiet and underutilized for years, came alive with activity and laughter. By late summer, even some of the HOA board members had started attending the parties, though they were careful to avoid any appearance of official endorsement. I made sure to welcome them warmly and treat them as valued neighbors rather than former adversaries. The goal was not to humiliate anyone, but rather to demonstrate that it was possible to have fun and build community without sacrificing individual rights or property ownership. The turning point came in early September, when I received an unexpected visit from Karen herself. She appeared at my door on a quiet Tuesday evening, looking more subdued and uncertain than I had ever seen her. Gone was the authoritative bearing and commanding presence that had characterized our previous interactions. Instead, she seemed almost tentative as she asked if we could have a private conversation. I invited her to sit on the deck, where we could talk without interruption while enjoying the peaceful evening atmosphere. For several minutes, we sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun set over the lake and listening to the gentle sounds of water lapping against the shore. Finally, Karen cleared her throat and began to speak in a voice that was notably different from the strident tone I had become accustomed to. "Jake, I owe you an apology," she began, her words coming slowly as if she was carefully considering each one. "I handled our entire conflict badly, and I let my desire to maintain control override my better judgment. I was wrong about the property ownership, wrong about your rights as a homeowner, and wrong about the way I tried to resolve our differences." I listened without interruption, recognizing that this conversation was probably as difficult for her as any she had ever had. Karen was clearly not someone who was accustomed to admitting error or showing vulnerability, and I could see that her apology was genuine rather than strategic. I have been thinking a lot about what happened, and I realized that I lost sight of what the Homeowners Association is supposed to